The summer sun never lies. The train platform shimmers under Wyoming's merciless sun, and Eleanor Brooks stands alone with a single suitcase and a marriage contract signed by a man who never came. The crowd disperses. The station empties. Heat rises from the rails in waves that bend the horizon. She has no money, no return ticket, no plan. Just as panic begins to claw at her chest, a barefoot boy tears across the platform, his small arms reaching, his voice breaking the stillness. "Mama!" He doesn't know her. She doesn't know him. But in that single moment, under the blazing summer sky, two abandoned souls recognize each other. Before we begin, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city name. I want to see just how far Eleanor's story travels. And if this story moves you, hit that like button and settle in. This one's going to stay with you. The Union Pacific locomotive hissed to a stop at the Marston Flats station with a groan of steel and steam, and Eleanor Brooks stepped down onto the wooden platform as if stepping off the edge of the known world. The Wyoming sun hit her like a forged door swinging open, bright, brutal, unapologetic. She squinted against it, one gloved hand shading her eyes, the other clutching the handle of a battered leather suitcase that held everything she owned. Around her, the platform buzzed with movement. Families reunited. Freight was unloaded. Men in dusty hats shouted instructions. But Eleanor stood still, scanning the crowd for a face she had only seen once, in a small tintype photograph sent 3 months prior. A face that had promised her a future. Jacob Langford, landowner, widower, respectable man seeking a respectable wife. She had written back. He had sent a train ticket. She had left Ohio with hope folded carefully in her chest, the way one might carry a fragile heirloom. Now, as the minutes stretched and the crowd thinned, that hope began to fracture. Eleanor set the suitcase down. The platform planks were bleached gray by sun and time, rough beneath her boots. Cicadas buzzed in the cottonwoods beyond the depot. The air smelled of sage, dust, and something faintly metallic, heat baking the iron rails. She waited. The station master, a wiry man with a tobacco-stained mustache, leaned out of the ticket window. "You waiting on someone, miss?" "Mr. Jacob Langford," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. "He was to meet me here." The man's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough. Pity, or perhaps recognition. He scratched his jaw. "Langford, you say?" "Yes." He hesitated, then shook his head. "Ain't seen him." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Could you check? Perhaps there's been a delay, a message." The station master disappeared into the depot. Eleanor heard him shuffling papers, muttering to himself. When he returned, his face was carefully neutral. "Nothing, miss. No messages. No word." She nodded once, as if this were perfectly reasonable. "I see. Thank you." He lingered, clearly uncertain whether to say more. Then he withdrew, leaving Eleanor alone on the platform as the last of the passengers drifted toward town. The train whistle blew, a long, mournful note. The engine began to chug, wheels grinding against rails, and then it pulled away, trailing smoke and steam, leaving Eleanor in its wake. She stood in the sudden quiet, the sun beating down, and felt the enormity of her situation settle over her like a weight. No one was coming. She had traveled 1,000 miles to marry a man who had not bothered to meet her. She had no family to return to, no friends in this territory. The money she'd brought, barely enough to last a week, was sewn into the lining of her coat. She was alone. For a moment, panic clawed at her ribs. She pressed a hand to her stomach, willing herself to breathe. The world tilted slightly, heat and exhaustion pressing in. She closed her eyes. "Think, Eleanor, think!" But before she could form a plan, a sound broke through the stillness. Running footsteps, small, urgent. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. A boy, no more than 5 or 6, was sprinting across the platform toward her, his bare feet slapping against the wood. His shirt was too big, sleeves rolled up, face smudged with dirt. His hair, a tangle of dark curls, flew behind him as he ran. And he was crying. Not the wailing of a tantrum, but the desperate, breathless sobs of a child who had been searching for something lost. "Mama!" he shouted. "Mama!" Eleanor's heart lurched. She glanced around, expecting to see a woman rushing after him, but there was no one. The boy's gaze was locked on her. He barreled into her with the full force of his small body, wrapping his arms around her skirts, burying his face in the fabric. His thin shoulders shook. Eleanor froze, hands hovering above him, unsure. I'm not... Luke! The voice was sharp, roughened by sun and work. A man strode onto the platform from the direction of the livery stable, his boots heavy against the planks. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat. His shirt was open at the collar, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms browned by labor. He reached them in 3 long strides and pulled the boy back, his grip firm but not harsh. "Luke, what in the hell?" He stopped, his gaze landing on Eleanor, his jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. He didn't mean—" The boy twisted in his father's arms, reaching for Eleanor again. "But she looks like... She's not your mama, Luke." The man's voice cracked, just barely, and he turned his face away, swallowing hard. "She's not." Eleanor looked down at the boy, whose tear-streaked face was turned up toward her with such raw longing it made her chest ache. Then she looked at the man, his sun-weathered skin, the tight line of his mouth, the exhaustion etched into every angle of his posture. "It's all right," Eleanor said quietly. "He startled me, that's all." The man nodded once, stiffly. He set the boy down but kept a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Luke. We need to go." But the boy didn't move. He stared at Eleanor as if memorizing her face. The man sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through dark, sweat-dampened hair. He met Eleanor's gaze directly for the first time, and she saw the color of his eyes, gray, like creekstone. "I apologize, ma'am. Truly. It's been hard for him." Eleanor nodded. "I understand." There was a pause, awkward and weighted. The man glanced at her suitcase, then back at her face. "You waiting on someone?" "I was," Eleanor said. "But it seems I was mistaken." His brow furrowed slightly. Understanding flickered across his features, followed by something darker. "Jacob Langford?" She blinked. "You know him?" "I know of him." The man's tone was flat, edged with something Eleanor couldn't name. He glanced toward the depot, then back at her. "He do this often?" "I don't understand." The man exhaled through his nose, a bitter sound. "You're not the first woman to step off that train expecting Jacob Langford." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "He sends tickets," the man continued, his voice low and steady. "Gets women to come out here, promising marriage, land, security. Then he disappears, takes whatever money they brought with them, sometimes more." The words hit her like stones. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, but she locked them, refusing to sway. "That's not possible. We corresponded for months. He sent photographs. He's a con man, ma'am." The man's voice was not unkind, but it was brutally honest. "And unless you've got family or funds, you're stranded." Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth of it was already settling into her bones. The man studied her face for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on and adjusted it low over his eyes. "You got a place to stay?" "No." "Money?" "Some." "How much?" Eleanor hesitated. Admitting vulnerability to a stranger felt dangerous, but lying felt worse. "Enough for a few days, perhaps a week." The man nodded slowly. He looked down at his son, who was still staring at Eleanor with wide, unblinking eyes. Then he looked back at her. "My name's Caleb Rowan. I run a ranch about 6 miles west of town. It's not much, but it's honest work. I could use help around the place, cooking, cleaning, mending. I can offer room and board. No pay to start, but you'd be fed and you'd have a roof." Eleanor stared at him. "You're offering me work." "I'm offering you a chance to not starve while you figure out what's next." Caleb's tone was matter of fact. "If you've got a better option, take it, but if you don't, the offer stands." She should have been wary. She should have questioned his motives, demanded references, asked why a man with a young son would invite a strange woman onto his property. But desperation has a way of narrowing choices. "I accept," Eleanor said. Caleb nodded. "All right then." He picked up her suitcase without asking, the muscles in his arm flexing beneath the fabric of his shirt. "Wagon's this way." Eleanor followed him across the platform, Luke walking between them, his small hand slipping into hers as if it belonged there. The wagon ride to the Rowan Ranch was silent, except for the creak of wheels and the rhythmic clop of hooves against hard-packed earth. Eleanor sat on the bench beside Caleb, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Luke sat between them, his head leaning against her arm, his eyes half closed. The land stretched out in all directions, rolling hills covered in dry grass, clusters of sage and juniper, the distant line of mountains jagged against the sky. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, a landscape that demanded strength. Caleb didn't speak, and Eleanor didn't press him. She studied his profile instead, the hard line of his jaw, the furrow between his brows, the way his hands held the reins with quiet competence. After a time, he broke the silence. Luke's mother died 2 years ago. Eleanor glanced at him, but he didn't look at her. Fever, Caleb continued, came on fast. She was gone in 3 days. His voice was flat, drained of emotion, as if he'd told the story too many times. He was 4, barely old enough to understand. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. Caleb nodded, but said nothing more. When the ranch came into view, Eleanor felt a pang of something she couldn't name. The house was small, wood frame, single story, with a sagging porch and shutters that needed paint. The barn leaned slightly to one side. Fences needed mending. Weeds grew thick around the foundation. It looked like a place that had been surviving, but not living. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down. He lifted Luke out, then offered Eleanor his hand. She took it, stepping down onto the dry earth. "It's not much," Caleb said, almost apologetically. "It's enough," Eleanor replied. He led her inside. The house was dim and cool, the air stale. Dust lay thick on every surface. Dishes were piled in the dry sink. The floor was tracked with mud. In the corner, a rocking chair sat motionless, a folded quilt draped over its back. Eleanor set her suitcase down and looked around. The neglect was not born of laziness, she realized. It was born of grief. Caleb stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable in his own home. "You can take the room at the end of the hall. It's small, but it's clean enough. I'll bring in some water so you can wash up." "Thank you," Eleanor said. He nodded and turned to go, but paused. "One more thing." "Yes?" He's been looking for his mother in every woman he sees. I need you to understand that. He's going to follow you. He's going to ask questions. He's going to—" Caleb's voice caught. He cleared his throat. "He's going to want things I can't give him." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I understand." "Do you?" "I do." Caleb studied her for a moment longer, then nodded and walked out. Eleanor stood alone in the silent house, dust motes drifting through the slanted light. She rolled up her sleeves. The first week passed in a blur of work. Eleanor scrubbed floors until her knees ached. She beat rugs, washed windows, swept the porch. She aired out the bedrooms, changed linens, and cleaned the kitchen until it gleamed. She cooked simple meals, beans, bread, stew, and set them on the table without ceremony. Caleb ate in silence, his eyes on his plate. Luke ate beside him, watching Eleanor with open fascination. At night, Eleanor lay in the small room at the end of the hall, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. She thought of Ohio, of the life she'd left behind, of the marriage that never was. She did not cry. During the day, Luke shadowed her everywhere. He sat on the kitchen floor while she kneaded dough. He followed her to the clothesline, handing her pins. He watched her mend Caleb's shirts, his small fingers tracing the stitches. He didn't call her mama again, but the word hung between them, unspoken. One afternoon, as Eleanor worked in the garden pulling weeds, Luke crouched beside her, digging in the dirt with a stick. "Do you like it here?" he asked suddenly. Eleanor paused, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "I'm not sure yet." "Papa says you're going to leave." She looked at him. "Did he?" Luke nodded. "He says everyone leaves." Eleanor's chest tightened. She set down the trowel and turned to face him fully. "Luke, I'm here now. That's what matters." "But you will leave," he insisted, his voice small. Won't you? Eleanor didn't answer right away. She couldn't promise him something she didn't know herself. I don't know what's going to happen, she said finally, but I'm not going anywhere today. Luke considered this, then nodded, satisfied for the moment. That night, after Luke was asleep, Eleanor found Caleb on the porch, sitting on the steps, a tin cup in his hand. The sky was filled with stars, so many they seemed to blur together. She hesitated, then sat down beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them. Thank you, she said quietly. For giving me a chance. Caleb didn't look at her. You've earned your keep. Still, he took a sip from the cup. Water, she realized, not whiskey. You don't have to thank me. You work hard. That's enough. They sat in silence for a while, the night settling around them. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said. Caleb glanced at her. Go ahead. Why did you help me? You didn't know me. You had no reason to trust me. Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Because I know what it's like to be stranded. And I know what it's like to need help and not get it. Eleanor nodded slowly. Your wife. We were young, thought we could make it on our own. Pride's a hell of a thing. He stared out at the dark hills. By the time I swallowed it and asked for help, it was too late. I'm sorry. Yeah, me too. Eleanor looked down at her hands, rough now from work, nails broken and dirt-stained. I didn't come here expecting charity. I came here expecting a future, and I got nothing. You got this, Caleb said, gesturing to the ranch. It's not nothing. It's not mine. No, but it's something. Eleanor met his gaze. In the starlight, his face was softer, less guarded. What happens when I've worked off my debt? Then you decide, Caleb said. Stay. Go. It's your choice. And Luke? Caleb's jaw tightened. Luke will be fine. But Eleanor heard the lie in his voice. Assis. The second week brought heat so intense it seemed to shimmer in the air. The land turned brittle. The creek slowed to a trickle. Dust coated everything. Eleanor worked through it, moving from task to task with quiet determination. She baked bread in the early morning before the kitchen became unbearable. She mended clothes in the shade of the porch. She taught Luke his letters, tracing them in the dirt with a stick. Caleb worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences, tending cattle, hauling water. He came in each evening exhausted, his shirt soaked through, his face lined with fatigue. Eleanor set meals in front of him without comment. He ate without thanks, but she didn't need thanks. The rhythm of it, the work, the routine, the silent understanding was enough. One evening, as she washed dishes, Caleb appeared in the doorway. There's a dance in town Saturday night, he said abruptly. Eleanor turned, surprised. A dance? Community thing, happens once a month. I usually don't go, but... He hesitated. People have been asking questions. About you. Figured it might be good if they saw you, saw that you're... He trailed off. Respectable? Eleanor finished, her tone dry. Caleb's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Something like that. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron. All right, I'll go. You don't have to. I know. Caleb nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. Eleanor? Yes? You've done good work here. I want you to know that. Before she could respond, he was gone. Saturday arrived with a clarity that felt almost unnatural, the sky so blue it hurt to look at, the air dry and still. Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing the only good dress she owned, a simple dove-gray cotton with a high collar and long sleeves. She pinned her hair up, checked her reflection in the small mirror, and took a steadying breath. When she stepped out of her room, Caleb was waiting by the door, hat in hand. He wore a clean shirt, his hair still damp from washing. He looked uncomfortable, but presentable. Luke tugged at his father's sleeve. Can I come? Not this time, son. Caleb's voice was gentle. Mrs. Harding's going to watch you tonight. Luke's face fell, but he didn't argue. He looked at Eleanor instead. You'll come back, right? I will, Eleanor promised. The boy nodded, then threw his arms around her waist in a sudden, fierce hug. Eleanor's hands hovered for a moment before settling on his shoulders, returning the embrace. When they pulled apart, Caleb was watching them with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. The dance was held in the community hall, a simple wooden structure at the edge of town. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over the crowd. A fiddler played in the corner, accompanied by a man on a battered piano. The air smelled of sweat, perfume, and punch. Eleanor entered beside Caleb, and the room quieted. Just for a moment, just long enough for every eye to land on her. Then the music resumed and the murmur of conversation returned. Caleb led her to a bench along the wall. "I'll get us some punch," he said, and disappeared into the crowd. Eleanor sat, hands folded in her lap, painfully aware of the stares. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men tipped their hats but didn't approach. Then a woman sat down beside her, older, with sharp eyes and a kind smile. "You must be the one staying out at the Rowan place." "I am," Eleanor said cautiously. "I'm Margaret Fletcher. I run the general store." She extended a hand and Eleanor shook it. "Don't mind the gawkers. Newcomers are always a spectacle." "I've noticed," Margaret laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "You've got spine. I like that." She leaned in conspiratorially. "And you've got that poor man's house looking better than it has in years. Folks have noticed." Eleanor flushed. "I'm just earning my keep." "Mm-hmm." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep at it. That family needs looking after." Caleb returned then, 2 cups of punch in hand. He passed one to Eleanor, nodded politely to Margaret, and stood awkwardly to the side. Margaret rose with a smile. "I'll leave you two be. Enjoy the evening." As she walked away, Caleb sat down beside Eleanor, closer than before. "She's harmless," he said quietly. "One of the few." Eleanor sipped her punch. It was overly sweet, but cold. "Are there many who aren't?" "Enough." They sat in companionable silence, watching couples spin across the floor. The music swelled, lively and bright. After a while, Caleb cleared his throat. "Would you like to dance?" Eleanor looked at him, startled. I'm not very good." "Neither am I." She smiled despite herself. "All right." He led her onto the floor, one hand settling lightly at her waist, the other holding hers. They moved stiffly at first, both self-conscious, but as the music continued, they found a rhythm. Eleanor looked up at him. "Thank you for bringing me tonight." "You deserve to be seen," Caleb said quietly, "not hidden away." Her breath caught. For a moment, the noise of the room faded, and it was just the two of them moving together beneath the lantern light. Then the song ended, and the spell broke. As they returned to the bench, a man approached, tall, with slicked back hair and a too-wide smile. "Caleb Rowan," the man said, his voice smooth as oil. "Didn't expect to see you here." Caleb's expression hardened. "Langford." Eleanor's heart stopped. The man turned his smile on her and his eyes gleamed with recognition. "And you must be Eleanor Brooks." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Jacob Langford extended his hand. "Pleasure to finally meet you in person." Eleanor did not take his hand. She stood perfectly still, her spine straight, her face composed, but inside her chest something cold and sharp twisted tight. Jacob Langford's smile didn't waver. He let his hand drop casually, as if her refusal meant nothing, and turned his attention back to Caleb. "I heard you'd taken in a stray," Langford said, his tone light, conversational. "Didn't realize it was one of mine." Caleb stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Eleanor and Langford. "She's not yours. She never was." Langford laughed, a smooth, practiced sound. "Well now, that's not entirely true, is it? We had an agreement, Miss Brooks and I. A contract." "A lie," Eleanor said, her voice low but steady. "You sent me a ticket and a promise. You gave me neither a marriage nor the decency of a warning." Langford's eyes flicked to her, and for just a moment something cold glinted beneath the charm. "I was delayed. Business matters. Surely you understand." "I understand perfectly." Eleanor's hands were trembling, so she folded them tightly in front of her. "You're a con man, and I'm not the first woman you've done this to." The music had stopped. The room had gone quiet. People were watching now, openly. Langford's smile thinned. Strong words, Miss Brooks, especially from a woman with no prospects and no place to go. He glanced around the room, playing to the crowd. I came here tonight to make things right, to honor our agreement. And this is the thanks I get? You don't want to honor anything, Caleb said, his voice hard as stone. You want her money. Whatever she's got left, you want it. And when it's gone, you'll disappear again. Langford's expression shifted, the mask slipping just enough to show irritation. This is between me and the lady, Rowan. It's got nothing to do with you. It's got everything to do with me. She's under my roof. That makes it my business. Your roof? Langford raised an eyebrow, his tone mocking. So you've taken to collecting strays now? First your boy, now this? Careful, Caleb. People might start to talk. Caleb's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Eleanor stepped forward. She would not hide behind him, not now. I owe you nothing, Mr. Langford, she said, her voice carrying across the silent hall. And I will give you nothing. If you have any decency left, you'll leave. Now. Langford studied her for a long moment, his eyes hard. Then he smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're making a mistake, Miss Brooks, but I'm a patient man. I'll give you time to reconsider. He tipped his hat, turned on his heel, and walked out. The room exhaled. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze, every whispered speculation. She wanted to run, to disappear, but she forced herself to stand still. Caleb touched her elbow gently. Come on, we're leaving. She nodded, and together they walked out of the hall into the cool night air. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Eleanor sat rigid on the wagon bench, her hands clenched in her lap. Caleb drove without speaking, the reins loose in his hands, his face unreadable in the darkness. When they arrived, Caleb helped her down, then stood there for a moment as if searching for words. He'll come back, he said finally. I know. He won't give up easy. Men like him don't. Eleanor met his gaze. I'm not afraid of him. Maybe you should be. Are you trying to scare me? I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're up against. Caleb's voice was firm, but not unkind. Langford's got a reputation. He's got friends. And he's got a talent for making people believe whatever he wants them to believe. Then we'll have to make sure the truth is louder, Eleanor said. Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, but from now on, you don't go anywhere alone. Not into town, not to the creek, nowhere. Understand? I'm not a prisoner, Caleb. No, but you're a target. He held her gaze. And I won't have you hurt because I didn't take this seriously enough. Eleanor wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't control. It was concern. All right, she said quietly. I'll be careful. Caleb nodded, then turned and headed toward the barn. Eleanor watched him go, then went inside. Mrs. Harding was dozing in the rocking chair, Luke asleep on the sofa. Eleanor thanked the older woman, paid her from her dwindling funds, and saw her out. Then she stood in the dim parlor, looking down at Luke's sleeping face. He looked peaceful, innocent, unaware of the storm gathering around them. Eleanor pulled the quilt up over his shoulders, brushed a curl away from his forehead, and whispered, I won't let anything happen to you. Then she went to her room and lay awake until dawn. The next morning, Caleb was already gone when Eleanor woke. She found a note on the kitchen table written in blocky, uneven letters. Gone to fix the north fence. Back by supper. Keep the doors locked. Eleanor folded the note and slipped it into her apron pocket. She made breakfast for Luke, watched him eat, then set him to work gathering eggs while she tackled the washing. The day was hot and still. Clouds gathered on the horizon but brought no rain, only the promise of it. Eleanor scrubbed clothes in the big wooden tub, her arms aching, sweat soaking through her dress. Luke played nearby, building structures out of sticks and stones, narrating elaborate stories to himself. Around midday, a rider appeared on the road. Eleanor's hand stilled in the washwater. She straightened, shading her eyes. The rider was too far away to identify, but something about the way he sat his horse made her pulse quicken. Luke? She called, keeping her voice calm. Come inside. The boy looked up, frowning. But I'm not done. Now, Luke. He heard the urgency in her tone and obeyed, abandoning his stick fort and running to her side. Eleanor took his hand and led him into the house, locking the door behind them. She went to the window and peered out through the gap in the curtains. The rider was closer now. A man in a dark coat, wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Not Langford. Someone else. He stopped at the edge of the yard and dismounted. Eleanor's breath came shallow. She glanced around the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. The fireplace poker, the cast-iron skillet. The man walked up to the porch and knocked. 3 sharp raps. Eleanor didn't move. Another knock, harder this time. "Mrs. Brooks?" The voice was unfamiliar, gravelly. "I know you're in there. I just want to talk." Eleanor's heart hammered. Luke pressed against her side, his small hand gripping her skirt. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm not here to hurt you. Mr. Langford sent me. He wants to apologize. He asked me to deliver a message." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She crossed to the door but didn't unlock it. "Say what you came to say and leave." There was a pause. "He wants to meet with you, private-like. Says he owes you an explanation." "He owes me nothing." "Ma'am, he's willing to make it worth your while, financially, I mean." Eleanor's stomach turned. "Tell Mr. Langford I have nothing to say to him, and if he sends anyone else to this house, I'll involve the sheriff." The man chuckled, low and unpleasant. "Sheriff's a friend of Mr. Langford's, just so you know." Eleanor's blood went cold. "Now, ma'am, you seem like a smart woman, so let me speak plain. Mr. Langford's a man who gets what he wants. One way or another, you can make this easy or you can make it hard, but either way, he's not walking away empty-handed." Eleanor stepped closer to the door, her voice hard. "Then he'll have to take it by force, and I promise you, I won't make it easy." Silence. Then the man laughed again. "All right then, your choice." She heard his boots on the porch steps, the creak of leather as he mounted his horse. Hoofbeats faded into the distance. Eleanor sagged against the door, her legs weak. Luke was staring at her, eyes wide. "Who was that?" he whispered. "No one important," Eleanor lied. She knelt down and took his face in her hands. "Listen to me, Luke. If anyone comes to the house when your papa's not here, you hide. Do you understand? You hide. And you don't come out until I say it's safe. But what about you? I'll be fine. But I need to know you're safe. Promise me." Luke nodded slowly. "I promise." Eleanor pulled him into a hug, holding him tight. When Caleb returned that evening, dusty and tired, Eleanor told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each word. When she finished, he set down his hat and rubbed a hand over his face. "Damn it," he muttered. "I knew he'd try something, but I didn't think he'd be this bold." "What do we do?" Eleanor asked. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "We fight back." The next morning, Caleb rode into town. He was gone for hours. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Well?" Eleanor asked. Caleb dismounted and tied his horse to the post. "Sheriff won't do anything. Says there's no proof Langford's done anything wrong. Says sending a man to deliver a message isn't a crime." Eleanor's hands curled into fists. "So he's just going to let this happen?" "Sheriff's bought and paid for. Has been for years." Caleb's voice was bitter. "But there's another option." "What?" "I talked to Margaret Fletcher. She knows other women Langford swindled. If we can get them to come forward, make a formal complaint to the territorial marshal, we might have a chance." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Will they do it?" "I don't know. Some of them left town. Others are too scared." Caleb met her gaze. "But Margaret thinks she can find at least 2 who'll talk." "That's a start." "Then we do it," Eleanor said firmly. Caleb nodded. "I'll help however I can. But Eleanor, you need to understand, this is going to get ugly. Langford's going to push back. Hard. I know. And if we lose, we won't." Caleb studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right. Then we fight." Over the next week, Margaret Fletcher worked quietly, reaching out to women Langford had wronged. 2 agreed to meet. One was a widow named Sarah Dalton who'd lost her savings to Langford's promises. The other was a young woman named Catherine Mills who'd been abandoned at the train station just like Eleanor. They met in the back room of the general store, curtains drawn, voices low. Sarah spoke first, her hands trembling as she recounted how Langford had courted her through letters, sent her a ticket, then taken the $300 she'd saved and disappeared. Catherine's story was nearly identical. She'd arrived 6 months before Eleanor, penniless and desperate. She'd worked as a laundress ever since, barely scraping by. Eleanor listened, her chest tight with anger and sorrow. These women had been used, discarded, and left to rebuild their lives from nothing. "We need to go to the marshal," Eleanor said. "Together." Sarah shook her head. "He won't believe us. We're just women. Langford's got money, connections." "Then we make him believe us," Eleanor interrupted. "We show him the letters, the tickets, the contracts. We show him the pattern. 1 woman, he can dismiss. 3? That's harder to ignore." Catherine looked uncertain. "And if it doesn't work?" "Then at least we tried." Eleanor's voice was steady. "At least we didn't let him win." Sarah and Catherine exchanged glances. Then, slowly, Sarah nodded. "All right, I'm in." Catherine hesitated, then nodded as well. "Me too." Margaret smiled, fierce and proud. "Good. I'll send word to the marshal. We'll arrange a meeting." But before they could act, Langford made his move. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. Caleb had ridden out to check the cattle. Eleanor was in the kitchen with Luke, teaching him to roll out dough for biscuits. The boy's hands were covered in flour, his face scrunched in concentration. Eleanor heard the horses before she saw them. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window. 3 riders approached the house, Langford in the lead. Her stomach dropped. "Luke," she said quietly, "go to your room, lock the door, don't come out." "But now." The boy obeyed, his face pale. Eleanor heard his footsteps, the click of the lock. Then she turned and walked to the door. Langford dismounted and climbed the porch steps, flanked by 2 men Eleanor didn't recognize. One was the man who'd come before. The other was younger, with a mean, narrow face. Eleanor opened the door before Langford could knock. She stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind her. "You're trespassing," she said. Langford smiled. "Now, Eleanor, is that any way to greet an old friend?" "We were never friends." "No," Langford agreed, "but we did have an agreement, and I'm here to collect." "There's nothing to collect. I owe you nothing." Langford's smile faded. "You owe me the money you brought with you, the money I paid for your ticket." "You sent the ticket as a promise of marriage. You broke that promise." "I was delayed. That's not the same as breaking a promise." Eleanor's hands shook, but she kept her voice steady. "Leave, now, before I scream loud enough for the neighbors to hear." Langford glanced around. "What neighbors?" "Nearest ranch is 4 miles east. No one's going to hear you, Eleanor." Fear shot through her, cold and sharp, but she didn't move. "Caleb will be back soon," she said. "Caleb Rowan's cattle got loose this morning, stampeded right through his north fence. He'll be busy for hours." Langford's smile returned. "Funny how things like that happen." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "You... me?" Langford shrugged. "I've been in town all morning. Witnesses can confirm it." The 2 men behind him grinned. Eleanor took a step back, her hand reaching for the door handle. Langford moved fast. He grabbed her wrist, his grip iron tight. "Now, Eleanor, let's talk like reasonable people." "Let go of me. Not until you listen." Eleanor twisted, trying to pull free, but his grip only tightened. Pain shot up her arm. "You've got 2 choices," Langford said, his voice low and cold. "You give me what I'm owed, or I take it. And trust me, you don't want me to take it. I'll scream." "Go ahead." Eleanor opened her mouth, and a gunshot cracked across the yard. Langford jerked back, releasing her. All 3 men spun toward the sound. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch, rifle raised, his face hard as granite. "Get your hands off her." Langford's expression twisted into something ugly. "This doesn't concern you, Rowan." "It concerns me just fine." Caleb worked the lever, chambering another round. "Now get off my property." The 2 men with Langford shifted nervously, hands moving toward their belts. "Don't," Caleb said, his voice flat. "I've got 6 rounds in this rifle, and I'm a real good shot. You want to test me? Go ahead." Langford's jaw tightened. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might actually try. Then he stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. "This isn't over," he said. "Yeah, it is." Langford smiled, cold and sharp. "You just made a real bad enemy, Rowan." "Get out!" Langford turned and walked to his horse, the two men following. They mounted and rode off, kicking up dust. Caleb didn't lower the rifle until they were out of sight. Then he set it down and turned to Eleanor. "You all right?" Eleanor nodded, though her hands were shaking. "He's sabotaged your fence." "I know." "He's not going to stop." "I know that too." Caleb's voice was grim. "But neither are we." That night, after Luke was asleep, Eleanor and Caleb sat at the kitchen table, a single candle burning between them. "We need to move fast," Caleb said. "Get to the marshal before Langford does." "Margaret's arranging the meeting, but it'll take a few days." "We might not have a few days." Eleanor looked down at her hands, still marked with faint bruises from Langford's grip. "Then we make them count." Caleb reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was unexpected, and Eleanor's breath caught. "I won't let him hurt you," Caleb said quietly. "Or Luke. I promise." Eleanor met his gaze, and in the candlelight his eyes were soft, earnest. "I know." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the silence heavy with things unsaid. Then Caleb pulled back, clearing his throat. "You should get some rest." Eleanor nodded and stood. But at the doorway she paused and looked back. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "Thank you. For today. For everything." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night." She went to her room, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the darkness, listening to the wind, thinking of Langford's cold smile and Caleb's steady hands. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The coyote's cry faded into silence, and Eleanor finally drifted into restless sleep just before dawn. She woke to the sound of Luke's voice outside her door, urgent and frightened. "Eleanor? Eleanor, wake up!" She bolted upright, heart pounding, and yanked open the door. Luke stood in his nightshirt, face pale, eyes wide. "What is it?" "Papa says to come quick. There's someone hurt." Eleanor grabbed her shawl and followed him into the kitchen. Caleb stood at the stove, heating water, his face grim. And slumped in a chair at the table was Catherine Mills, her dress torn, her lips split and bleeding, one eye swollen nearly shut. Eleanor rushed to her side. "Catherine, what happened?" The young woman tried to speak but winced, touching her ribs gingerly. "Langford," she whispered. "He came to my room last night. Said if I testified against him, he'd make sure I never worked in this town again." Her voice cracked. "I told him I wasn't afraid, so he... She broke down, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Eleanor's hands curled into fists. She looked at Caleb, who stood rigid, jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Luke," Caleb said quietly, "go feed the chickens." "But Papa, now!" The boy fled. Caleb brought the warm water and clean cloths to the table. Eleanor took them and began gently cleaning the blood from Catherine's face. The younger woman flinched but didn't pull away. "Where were you staying?" Eleanor asked softly. "The boarding house on 2nd Street. Mrs. Kelly's place." "Does she know you're here?" Catherine shook her head. "I left before dawn. I was so scared. I didn't know where else to go." "You did the right thing," Eleanor said firmly. She dabbed at the cut on Catherine's lip, her touch as gentle as she could manage. "You're safe here." Catherine's good eye filled with tears. "I can't testify now. If I do, he'll kill me. I know he will." "He won't get the chance," Caleb said, his voice hard. "I'm riding to Fort Laramie today. The territorial marshal's stationed there. If the local law won't help us, I'll go over their heads." Eleanor looked up at him. "That's a 2-day ride." "I know. You'll be leaving us alone." Caleb met her gaze. "I'm leaving you my rifle and my shotgun. You know how to shoot?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Her father had taught her when she was young, though she'd never shot at anything but tin cans. "Well enough." "Good." Caleb moved to the corner and pulled down the rifle from its rack, then retrieved the shotgun from the cabinet. He set both on the table along with a box of shells. "Keep the doors locked. Don't open them for anyone but me or Margaret. If Langford or his men come back, you fire a warning shot first. If they don't leave, you aim to kill." Catherine gasped. Eleanor's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand." Caleb turned to Catherine. "You're staying here until I get back. Eleanor will look after you." Catherine nodded, too exhausted to argue. Within the hour, Caleb was packed and mounted. Eleanor walked out to see him off, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. The sun was just breaking over the hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Caleb looked down at her from the saddle. 2 days there, 1 day to find the marshal and explain the situation, 2 days back. 5 days total if everything goes smooth. And if it doesn't? Then I'll get word to you somehow. He hesitated, then reached down and touched her shoulder briefly. "You're stronger than you think, Eleanor. Don't forget that." Before she could respond, he spurred his horse and rode out, dust rising in his wake. Eleanor stood watching until he disappeared over the ridge. Then she turned and went back inside. The first day passed in tense quiet. Eleanor tended to Catherine's injuries, made meals, kept Luke occupied with chores and lessons. Catherine slept most of the day, her body demanding rest. By evening, the swelling around her eye had gone down slightly, and she was able to eat a little soup. Luke kept asking when his father would be back. Eleanor told him 5 days, maybe 6. The boy's face fell, but he didn't complain. That night, Eleanor locked every door and window. She kept the shotgun propped beside her bed and slept in her clothes, ears straining for any sound. None came. The second day brought clouds and the smell of rain. Eleanor worked in the garden while Luke played nearby, building elaborate forts out of sticks and stones. Catherine sat on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching. Around midday, Margaret Fletcher arrived in her wagon, a basket of supplies in the back. Eleanor had never been so glad to see another person. Margaret climbed down and embraced her. "Caleb stopped by the store on his way out of town, told me what happened." She looked past Eleanor to Catherine on the porch, and her expression hardened. "That bastard." "He's getting worse," Eleanor said quietly. "Bolder." "That's because he thinks he can't be touched. Men like him always do." Margaret handed Eleanor the basket. "I brought bandages, salve, some food, and this." She pulled a small derringer from her apron pocket. Eleanor stared at it. "Margaret, just in case," Margaret said firmly. "You've got the shotgun and rifle, but this is easier to carry. Keep it in your pocket. If Langford gets close enough that you need it, don't hesitate." Eleanor took the gun, feeling the weight of it in her palm. It was small, almost delicate, but deadly. "Thank you," she whispered. Margaret squeezed her hand. "You're not alone in this, Eleanor. There are more of us than you think, women who've been hurt by men like him. We look out for each other." After Margaret left, Eleanor tucked the derringer into her apron pocket. The weight of it was a comfort and a warning all at once. That night, the rain finally came. It started as a drizzle, then built into a steady downpour that drummed against the roof and turned the yard to mud. Eleanor lay in bed listening to it, the shotgun within arm's reach, and tried not to think about Caleb riding through this weather. The third day dawned gray and wet. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with clouds. Eleanor went about her morning routine, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, making breakfast. Luke helped without being asked, his small face serious. Catherine was stronger today. She came to the kitchen and sat at the table, sipping coffee, her hands wrapped around the cup for warmth. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about what I'll say to the marshal, if he comes." "When he comes," Eleanor corrected. Catherine managed a small, pained smile. "When he comes. I want to make sure I say it right, that I don't forget anything." "Tell the truth," Eleanor said. "That's all you need to do." "The truth didn't help me last time." Eleanor sat down across from her. "Because you were alone. This time, you're not." Catherine's eyes welled up, but she blinked the tears back. "Why are you doing this? You could just leave. Take what little you have and go somewhere else. Start over." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I thought about it," she admitted. "That first week, I thought about it every day. But then I realized running doesn't solve anything. It just means he wins. And I'm tired of men like him winning." Catherine nodded slowly. "Me too." They sat in companionable silence, drinking their coffee, while Luke played with his wooden animals on the floor. The quiet was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. Eleanor's head snapped up. Catherine went pale. Luke froze, his toy horse clutched in one hand. Eleanor moved to the window and peered out through the gap in the curtain. Her blood ran cold. 6 riders approached the house. Langford led them, flanked by the same 2 men from before and 3 others Eleanor didn't recognize. They rode slowly, deliberately, fanning out as they reached the yard. "Catherine, take Luke to the back room," Eleanor said, her voice calm despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Lock the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Eleanor, now." Catherine grabbed Luke's hand and pulled him down the hall. Eleanor heard the door close, the lock click into place. She went to the table and picked up the shotgun, checking to make sure it was loaded. It was. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, then walked to the front door. Langford dismounted and climbed the porch steps. The other men stayed on their horses, forming a loose semicircle around the house. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock. She stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun held across her chest, finger resting near the trigger. "You're not welcome here," she said. Langford smiled, but it was a different smile now, colder, meaner. The charm was gone, replaced by something predatory. "Where's Rowan?" "None of your concern." "Oh, I think it is. See, I heard he rode out 2 days ago, headed north, which means you're here all alone." "Well, not quite alone." His gaze flicked to the house. "I know Catherine's in there. And the boy." Eleanor's grip tightened on the shotgun. "Leave, now, or I'll shoot." Langford laughed. "You won't shoot. You're a lady, Eleanor. Ladies don't shoot people." "You'd be surprised what ladies do when they're pushed too far." His smile faded. "I'm done playing games. You owe me money. Catherine owes me silence. I'm collecting both today." "You're owed nothing." Langford's expression hardened. He turned and gestured to the men behind him. "Search the house." 2 of them dismounted. Eleanor raised the shotgun, aiming it directly at Langford's chest. "Take one more step and I'll kill you." The men hesitated. Langford's eyes narrowed. "You won't." "Try me." For a long moment they stared at each other. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the restless shifting of the horses. Then Langford took a step forward. Eleanor pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast was deafening. The shot went wide, intentionally, into the porch post beside Langford's head. Splinters exploded. The horses screamed and shied. The men scrambled back. Langford stumbled, his face white with shock. Eleanor worked the pump, chambering another shell. "The next one goes through your chest." Langford stared at her, breathing hard. Then his expression twisted into fury. "You stupid bitch! You think this changes anything? I think it means you're leaving. Now. I'll burn this place to the ground. Then you'll hang for it." "No one's going to hang me. I own this town." "You don't own me." Langford's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might actually rush her, shotgun or no shotgun. But then one of the men called out, "Boss, we should go. Someone might have heard that shot." Langford didn't move. His eyes were locked on Eleanor, burning with hatred. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. "Yes, it is." He turned abruptly and stalked to his horse. The other men followed. They mounted and rode out, but not quickly. Slowly, deliberately, as if to prove they weren't afraid. Eleanor stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then her legs gave out, and she sank down onto the steps, the shotgun clattering beside her. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. The door opened behind her. Catherine appeared, Luke pressed against her side. "Eleanor?" Catherine's voice was small, frightened. Eleanor looked up at her. "It's all right. They're gone." "You shot at him." "I did." Catherine sat down beside her, pulling Luke with her. The 3 of them sat there on the porch steps, saying nothing, as the clouds finally broke and rain began to fall again. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair by the window, the shotgun across her lap, watching the darkness. Every sound made her tense. The creak of the house settling, the wind rattling the shutters, the distant cry of an owl. Catherine and Luke slept in Eleanor's room, the door locked. Eleanor had insisted. If Langford came back in the night, she wanted them safe. The hours crawled past. Midnight, 1 o'clock, 2. Eleanor's eyes burned with exhaustion, but she forced them to stay open. At 3, she heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the house. Her heart hammered. She stood slowly, moving to the window, peering out into the darkness. A shadow moved past the barn. Then another. They were out there, watching, waiting. Eleanor's breath came shallow. She checked the shotgun again, though she knew it was loaded. Then she moved to the back window, watching. One of the shadows detached from the barn and moved toward the chicken coop. Eleanor realized what they were doing, trying to draw her out, make her think they were just after livestock. She stayed where she was. The shadow reached the coop. There was a brief commotion, the startled squawking of chickens, then silence. Eleanor waited. Minutes passed. The shadows retreated, melting back into the darkness beyond the barn. Then nothing. Eleanor stood by the window until dawn broke, gray and cold. Only then did she lower the shotgun and sink into the chair, her body trembling with exhaustion. When Catherine emerged from the bedroom, she took one look at Eleanor and gasped, "You didn't sleep at all." "I couldn't." "Eleanor, they were here last night, outside the house." Catherine's face went white. "Did they try to get in?" "No, they were just watching, waiting." Eleanor rubbed her eyes. "They killed 3 of the chickens." Luke appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What happened to the chickens?" Eleanor forced a smile. "Fox got them, sweetheart. It happens sometimes." But Catherine knew the truth, and the fear in her eyes reflected Eleanor's own. The 4th day was the hardest. Eleanor moved through her chores like a ghost, exhaustion weighing down every movement. Catherine tried to help, but she was still recovering. Luke sensed the tension and stayed close, quiet and watchful. Margaret came again in the afternoon, bringing more food and news from town. "Langford's telling everyone you tried to kill him," she said, her voice tight with anger. "Says you're dangerous, unstable. He's got half the town believing him." Eleanor's stomach sank. "And the other half?" "Don't believe a word of it, but they're too scared to say so." Margaret gripped Eleanor's hands. "Where's Caleb?" "Fort Laramie, getting the marshal." "When will he be back?" "Tomorrow, maybe the day after." Margaret's expression was grave. "You need to hold on until then. Can you do that?" Eleanor met her gaze. "I don't have a choice." That night, Eleanor fortified the house as best she could. She barricaded the back door with the heavy kitchen table. She nailed boards across the shutters. She loaded both the rifle and the shotgun, setting them within easy reach. Catherine watched, her face pale. "You really think he'll come back?" "I know he will." "When?" "Tonight. Tomorrow night. Whenever he thinks we're weakest." Eleanor turned to face her. "But we're not weak. We're not going to break. And when Caleb gets back with the marshal, Langford's going to pay for everything he's done." Catherine nodded, but her hands were shaking. Eleanor made them all eat, though none of them had much appetite. Then she sent Catherine and Luke to bed again with strict instructions to stay there no matter what they heard. Then she took up her position by the window and waited. The night was clear, the moon nearly full. Eleanor could see the yard clearly, the barn, the fence line, the road beyond. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Eleanor's eyes drifted closed once, twice. She jerked herself awake, pinching her arm hard enough to bruise. And then she saw them. 4 riders, moving slowly up the road. They stopped at the edge of the property, silhouettes against the moonlit sky. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. She raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel. The riders sat motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then one of them dismounted. He walked forward, into the yard, his hands held out to his sides. Not Langford, someone else, one of the men from before. He stopped about 20 yards from the house and called out, "Mrs. Brooks, we don't want any trouble. Mr. Langford just wants to talk." Eleanor didn't answer. "Mrs. Brooks, we know you're tired. We know you're scared. But this doesn't have to end badly. Just come out, talk to Mr. Langford, work something out." Silence. The man took another step forward. "Mrs. Brooks," Eleanor fired. The shot hit the ground 3 feet in front of him, kicking up dirt and stone. The man yelped and scrambled backward. "The next one won't miss," Eleanor shouted. The man ran back to his horse and mounted in a scramble of limbs. The four riders turned and rode off into the darkness. Eleanor lowered the rifle, her hands shaking violently. She sank down below the window and pressed her back against the wall, heart hammering. From the bedroom she heard Luke crying. Catherine's voice murmured softly, trying to comfort him. Eleanor closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. One more day, just one more day. The fifth day dawned bright and clear, and Eleanor woke slumped against the wall beneath the window, the rifle still clutched in her hands. Every muscle in her body ached. Her eyes felt full of sand. Catherine found her there and gasped. "Eleanor, you have to rest." "I will, when Caleb gets back." "You're going to collapse." "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. She was running on nothing but will and fear. The morning passed in a haze. Eleanor forced herself to eat, to drink water, to stay upright. She checked and rechecked the guns. She watched the road. Luke stayed close, his small hand slipping into hers whenever she stood still long enough. "Is Papa coming home today?" he asked for the 10th time. "I hope so, sweetheart." "Me too." Afternoon came. The sun beat down, relentless. Eleanor stood on the porch, shading her eyes, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Catherine joined her. "What if he doesn't come?" "He'll come." "But what if—" "He'll come." The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Eleanor's hope began to waver, and then, just as the last light was fading, she saw it. A rider, moving fast, coming up the road from the north. Eleanor's heart leapt. She grabbed the rifle, just in case, and stepped down off the porch. The rider drew closer, closer. It was Caleb. Relief hit her so hard her knees nearly buckled. She set down the rifle and waited, watching him come. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of the house and dismounted in one swift motion. He looked exhausted, covered in dust, his eyes red-rimmed. But he was smiling. "I got him," Caleb said. "The marshal's coming. He'll be here tomorrow with 2 deputies. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. "You did it!" "We did it." Caleb stepped forward and, without thinking, pulled her into his arms. Eleanor froze for a heartbeat, then melted into the embrace. She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the smell of dust and leather and safety. "I thought you weren't coming back," she whispered. "I promised I would." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the fading light. Then Luke came running out of the house, shouting, "Papa! Papa!" and threw himself at Caleb's legs. Caleb released Eleanor and scooped up his son, holding him tight. Eleanor wiped her eyes and smiled, her chest full of something warm and fragile. Tomorrow, the marshal would come. Tomorrow, Langford would answer for what he'd done. But tonight, they were safe. Tonight, they had won. That night, Eleanor slept for the first time in 5 days. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the window and the smell of coffee filled the house. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Caleb at the stove, frying eggs and bacon. Luke sat at the table, swinging his legs, chattering about a bird's nest he'd found in the barn. Catherine was pouring coffee, her movements still careful, but steadier than before. Caleb looked up when Eleanor entered. "Morning. Figured you could use the rest." "Thank you." Eleanor accepted the cup Catherine offered and sat down. "What time is the marshal expected?" "Around noon," he said. "Maybe earlier if they made good time." So Caleb set a plate in front of her. "Eat. You're going to need your strength." Eleanor picked up her fork but found her appetite had vanished. Her stomach was a knot of nerves. "What do we do until then?" "We wait, and we stay ready." Caleb's expression was serious. "The marshal will want to hear from all 3 of you, Catherine, Sarah Dalton, and you. He'll want to see the letters, the contracts, any proof you've got." Catherine set down her coffee cup with a trembling hand. "What if Langford runs? If he knows the marshal's coming, he might just leave town." "He won't," Caleb said with certainty. "Men like him don't run. They think they're untouchable. And even if he wanted to, I've got friends watching the roads. If he tries to leave, we'll know." Eleanor met his gaze across the table. "You've been planning this since the day I rode out. The marshal's a good man, fair, but he needed evidence and he needed witnesses willing to talk." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I told him everything. He believed me, He needs to hear it from you. Eleanor nodded slowly. The weight of what was coming settled over her shoulders, but it no longer felt crushing. It felt like purpose. They spent the morning preparing. Eleanor gathered every letter Langford had sent her, every scrap of paper that bore his name or his promises. Catherine did the same, her hands shaking as she unfolded the worn pages. I kept them all, Catherine whispered. I don't know why. Maybe I thought someday they'd matter. They matter now, Eleanor said firmly. By 11 o'clock, everything was ready. The letters were arranged on the kitchen table in careful stacks. Eleanor had changed into her best dress, and Catherine had borrowed one of Eleanor's, the fabric loose on her thinner frame but clean and respectable. Luke sensed the importance of the day and stayed quiet, playing with his wooden animals in the corner, his eyes darting between the adults. At 11:30, Caleb stood at the window, watching the road. Eleanor stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. What if they don't believe us? She asked quietly. They will. But what if they don't? Caleb turned to look at her. Then we make them. We don't give up until they do. Eleanor's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, to thank him for everything he'd done, but the words stuck. Before she could find them, Caleb stiffened. They're here. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, moving at a steady pace. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out details. A man in the center wearing a star on his vest, flanked by 2 younger men carrying rifles. The marshal was older than Eleanor had expected, perhaps in his late 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent in hard country. He dismounted with the ease of a man long accustomed to the saddle and tipped his hat to Caleb. Marshal Hendricks, Caleb said, shaking his hand. Thank you for coming. Mr. Rowan. Hendricks' voice was gravelly but not unkind. His eyes moved to Eleanor and Catherine, taking in their faces with a careful, assessing gaze. Ladies, Eleanor stepped forward. I'm Eleanor Brooks. This is Catherine Mills. Hendricks nodded. I understand you both have complaints to file against Jacob Langford. We do, Eleanor said, and we're not the only ones. So Mr. Rowan told me. Hendricks gestured to his deputies, who dismounted and tied their horses. Let's go inside and talk. They gathered around the kitchen table, the letters spread out before them. Luke had been sent outside with instructions to play near the barn, but not to wander. Eleanor could see him through the window, building another of his stick forts. Hendricks pulled out a small notebook and a pencil. All right, let's start from the beginning. Miss Brooks, you first. Eleanor took a breath and began. She told him about the letters, the promises, the train ticket sent with such careful timing that she'd had no reason to doubt. She told him about arriving at the platform to find no one waiting, about Langford's appearance at the dance, his threats, the men he'd sent to intimidate her. Hendricks listened without interrupting, his pencil moving across the page in quick, precise strokes. When Eleanor finished, he looked up. And you have the letters he sent? Eleanor pushed the stack across the table. All of them. Hendricks picked them up, reading through each one carefully. His expression remained neutral, but Eleanor saw his jaw tighten as he read. These are good, he said finally. Very good. They establish a pattern of deception, but I need more than letters. I need witnesses to actual crimes. He had Catherine beaten, Eleanor said, her voice shaking with anger. Look at her face. Hendricks turned to Catherine, his gaze softening slightly. Miss Mills, can you tell me what happened? Catherine's voice was small at first, hesitant, but as she spoke it grew stronger. She told him about the night Langford came to her room, about his threats, about the beating. She told him about the fear that had kept her silent for so long. When she finished, Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Did anyone else see your injuries? A doctor? A neighbor? Mrs. Fletcher, Catherine said. From the general store. She helped Eleanor tend to me. Good. I'll need to speak with her. Hendricks made another note. Anyone else? Sarah Dalton, Eleanor said. She's another woman Langford swindled. She's willing to testify. I'll need to speak with her too. Hendricks closed his notebook and looked at both women. I want you to understand something. What you're doing is brave, but it's also dangerous. Men like Langford don't go quietly. If If I arrest him, he's going to fight back. He's going to try to discredit you, to make you look like liars, or worse. Are you prepared for that? Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. Yes. Miss Mills? Catherine hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I'm ready. Hendricks studied them both, then nodded. All right, then let's go get him. The ride into town was tense. Hendricks and his deputies led the way, followed by Caleb's wagon, with Eleanor and Catherine in the back. Luke had been left with Margaret Fletcher, who'd arrived just as they were preparing to leave. The older woman had taken one look at their faces and pulled Luke into a fierce hug, promising him cookies and stories until they returned. The town was quiet when they arrived, the main street nearly empty in the afternoon heat. A few people stopped to stare as the marshal's group rode past, their eyes widening when they saw Eleanor and Catherine. Word would spread fast, Eleanor knew. By evening, everyone would know what was happening. Hendricks stopped in front of the saloon where Langford was known to spend his afternoons. He dismounted and turned to his deputies. Stay with the wagon. Keep these ladies safe. Then he looked at Caleb. You coming? Caleb nodded and climbed down from the wagon. Caleb, Eleanor called. He turned and she met his eyes. Be careful. He nodded once, then followed Hendricks into the saloon. Eleanor and Catherine sat in the wagon bed, hands clasped together, waiting. The minutes stretched like hours. People began to gather on the street, whispering, pointing. Eleanor kept her chin up, refusing to look away. Then the saloon doors swung open and Langford emerged, flanked by Hendricks and Caleb. Langford's hands were bound in front of him, but his face was twisted with fury. This is a mistake, he shouted, loud enough for the whole street to hear. I've done nothing wrong. These women are lying. Hendricks ignored him and steered him toward the small jailhouse at the end of the street. The crowd followed, growing larger with each step. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, Catherine beside her. They walked slowly, deliberately, following the procession. Langford's eyes found Eleanor in the crowd. You'll regret this, he spat. You hear me? You'll regret this. Eleanor stopped walking. She looked at him directly, her voice carrying clear and strong. The only regret I have is believing you in the first place. The crowd murmured. Langford's face went red with rage, but Hendricks pushed him forward into the jailhouse and slammed the door. For a moment, the street was silent. Then Margaret Fletcher appeared at Eleanor's side, Luke's hand in hers. The older woman's face was fierce with pride. Well done, she said quietly. Eleanor's knees went weak. Catherine caught her arm, steadying her. Is it over? Catherine whispered. Not yet, Eleanor said, but we're closer. The trial was set for 3 days later. Hendricks explained that he needed time to gather all the witnesses, to build the strongest case possible. In the meantime, Langford would remain in jail, his bail set so high that even his wealthy friends couldn't meet it. Those 3 days felt longer than all the weeks before combined. Eleanor and Catherine stayed at the ranch, preparing their testimony, going over every detail until the words were burned into memory. Caleb worked the ranch as usual, but Eleanor noticed he kept the rifle close, his eyes scanning the horizon more often than before. On the morning of the trial, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled, people standing along the walls and crowding in the doorway. Eleanor sat in the front row beside Catherine and Sarah Dalton, who'd arrived the night before, her face pale but determined. The judge was a severe-looking man named Blackwell, with white hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He called the court to order and the room fell silent. Langford sat at the defense table, his lawyer beside him, a slick man from Cheyenne with oiled hair and an expensive suit. Langford's face was composed now, almost pleasant, as if this were all a simple misunderstanding. The prosecutor was a young man named Davis, earnest and intense. He rose and addressed the judge. Your Honor, the territory calls Eleanor Brooks to the stand. Eleanor stood, her legs steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. She walked to the witness stand and placed her hand on the Bible. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. She sat down and looked out at the courtroom. Every eye was on her. In the third row, Caleb sat with Luke on his lap, his face calm and encouraging. Davis approached. Miss Brooks, please tell the court how you came to know the defendant. Eleanor took a breath and began. She told her story clearly, without embellishment, her voice never wavering. She described the letters, the promises, the train ticket, the empty platform, Langford's threats, the attack on Catherine, the men who'd come to the ranch. As she spoke, she watched Langford's face. He sat motionless, but his eyes were cold, calculating. When she finished, Davis nodded. Thank you, Miss Brooks. Your witness. Langford's lawyer stood, smoothing his jacket. Miss Brooks, isn't it true that you came to Wyoming seeking a husband? Yes. And isn't it true that you had very little money? Yes. So you were desperate, weren't you? Desperate enough to accept the first offer that came along? Eleanor's jaw tightened. I was hopeful, not desperate. Hope, desperation. Aren't they much the same for a woman in your position? The lawyer's tone was patronizing. A woman alone, without means, without prospects? My prospects were my own concern. And yet you expected my client to provide for you, did you not? To give you a home, security, a future. I expected him to honor his word. That's not the same thing. But when he didn't appear at the station, you didn't leave. You stayed. You inserted yourself into Mr. Rowan's household. Why? Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. Because I had nowhere else to go. Mr. Langford saw to that. Or perhaps because you saw an opportunity. Another man, another household, another chance at security. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel. Eleanor leaned forward. I worked for my place at the Rowan Ranch. I earned every meal, every night's shelter. I asked for nothing I didn't work for. The lawyer smiled thinly. Of course. No further questions. Eleanor stepped down, her hands shaking with anger. Catherine squeezed her arm as she sat. Next, Catherine took the stand. She told her story with quiet dignity, her voice breaking only when she described the beating. Several women in the courtroom wiped their eyes. Langford's lawyer tried the same tactics with her, suggesting she was a scorned woman seeking revenge. But Catherine didn't break. I'm not seeking revenge, she said. I'm seeking justice. There's a difference. Sarah Dalton testified next, then Margaret Fletcher, who described treating Catherine's injuries and hearing Eleanor's account of Langford's threats. Each testimony built on the last, creating a picture so clear and damning that even Langford's lawyer seemed to struggle. Finally, Caleb was called. He testified about finding Eleanor at the station, about the day Langford and his men came to the ranch, about the intimidation and threats. And what did you observe about Miss Brooks during her time at your ranch? Davis asked. Caleb's voice was steady. She worked harder than anyone I've ever known. She never complained, never asked for anything she hadn't earned. She brought life back to a house that had been dead for 2 years. And your son? How did he respond to her? Caleb's expression softened. He called her mama because she gave him what he'd been missing, someone who cared. The courtroom was utterly silent. When Caleb stepped down, he looked directly at Eleanor. Something passed between them, unspoken but understood. The prosecution rested. Langford's lawyer called only one witness, Langford himself. Langford took the stand with confidence, his posture relaxed, his voice smooth. He denied everything. The letters were misunderstood. The women had expectations he'd never promised to fulfill. The threats were fabricated. The beating, he knew nothing about it. These are desperate women, Your Honor, he said, his tone reasonable. Women who came west seeking husbands and found none. Is it my fault they placed their hopes in letters that were meant only as friendly correspondence? Davis stood for cross-examination. Mr. Langford, how many train tickets have you sent to women in the past 3 years? Langford hesitated. I don't recall the exact number. More than 5? Perhaps. More than 10? I said I don't recall. Davis pulled out a sheaf of papers. I have here receipts from the Union Pacific Railroad showing that you purchased tickets for 17 different women over the past 3 years. 17. All of them one-way tickets to Marston Flats. All of them sent with promises of marriage. The courtroom exploded. The judge hammered his gavel, calling for order. Langford's composure cracked. Those tickets were gifts, gifts that you then used to extort money from desperate women, Davis's voice cut like a blade. Women who arrived here with nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no choice but to give you whatever they had? That's not... I never... Where are those 17 women now, Mr. Langford? Can you account for even half of them? Langford's face had gone pale. His lawyer stood, objecting, but the damage was done. The judge called a recess. Eleanor sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding as people filed out for air. Catherine was crying quietly. Sarah gripped her hand. "We did it," Sarah whispered. "We actually did it." But Eleanor wouldn't let herself believe it. Not yet. When the court reconvened, the judge looked tired. He surveyed the room, then spoke. "I've heard enough testimony today to make a determination. The evidence against Jacob Langford is substantial and credible. The testimony of these women is consistent and corroborated. Mr. Langford, I find you guilty of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit assault." The courtroom erupted. Langford surged to his feet, shouting, but the bailiff restrained him. The judge continued, his voice rising over the noise. "You will be sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison. In addition, you will pay restitution to each of the women you defrauded, the amounts to be determined by a separate hearing." Langford was dragged from the courtroom, still shouting, his face twisted with rage. Eleanor sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Beside her, Catherine was sobbing. Sarah's face was buried in her hands. Then Caleb was there, pulling Eleanor to her feet, his arms around her. "You did it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You did it, Eleanor." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "We did it." Outside the courtroom, people crowded around them. Some offered congratulations. Others simply stared. Margaret Fletcher pushed through the crowd and embraced Eleanor fiercely. "I knew you had it in you," she said. "I knew it." That night, back at the ranch, Eleanor sat on the porch steps as the sun set. Luke was asleep inside, exhausted from the day's excitement. Catherine had returned to town with Sarah, the two women clinging to each other, still processing their victory. Caleb came out and sat beside Eleanor, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He passed her one. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked finally. "Now you decide," Caleb said quietly. "Decide what?" "What you want, where you want to be." He paused. "You're free, Eleanor. You can go anywhere, do anything." Eleanor looked down at her coffee. The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. "And if I wanted to stay?" she asked softly. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down his cup and turned to face her. "Then I'd ask you to stay. Not as someone who works for her keep, but as someone who belongs here." Eleanor's heart hammered. She met his gaze and saw vulnerability there, hope mixed with fear. "Luke needs you," Caleb continued. "This place needs you. And I," his voice caught, "I need you." Eleanor set down her own cup. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. "I want to stay," she whispered. "I want to stay, Caleb." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Then stay." They sat there on the porch steps, hands clasped, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Inside the house, Luke stirred in his sleep, safe and whole. And for the first time since stepping off that train under the brutal summer sun, Eleanor felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt home. The stars multiplied overhead as Eleanor and Caleb sat together, their hands still intertwined. Neither spoke for a long while, both content to let the silence settle around them like a blanket. The night air was cool and carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. "There's something I need to say." Eleanor turned to look at him, her heart quickening. "When my wife died, I thought I was done. Done feeling, done hoping, done believing there could be anything good left in this world." His voice was rough, each word clearly costing him. "I kept this place running for Luke's sake, but I was just going through the motions. Then you showed up at that train station, and Luke ran to you like he'd been waiting his whole life for you to arrive." Eleanor's throat tightened. "At first I told myself it was just him being a confused little boy, that he saw you and saw his mama and couldn't tell the difference. But it wasn't that." Caleb looked at her directly. his gray eyes reflecting starlight. He saw something I was too scared to see. He saw someone who could bring us back to life. Caleb, let me finish. He squeezed her hand gently. You came here with nothing. Everything had been taken from you. And instead of becoming bitter, instead of giving up, you dug in. You worked. You fought. You stood up to a man who terrorized this whole town. His voice cracked slightly. You're the bravest person I've ever known, Eleanor Brooks. And if you'll have us, me and Luke, I'd like to build a real future with you. Not out of necessity or convenience, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. She'd come to Wyoming expecting a marriage built on practicality, on mutual need, and nothing more. But this was something entirely different. This was real. I came here thinking I needed someone to save me, she said softly. But the truth is, I saved myself. We saved each other. She reached up and touched his face, her palm against the rough stubble of his jaw. Yes, Caleb. Yes to all of it. He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. They sat like that until the moon rose, silver and full, casting long shadows across the ranch. When they finally went inside, the house felt different. Not just a shelter, not just a place to work and sleep, but a home. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Eleanor woke to the sound of Luke's laughter and the smell of bacon frying. She dressed quickly and found Caleb and Luke in the kitchen, the boy standing on a chair to help his father cook. Careful with that fork, Caleb was saying. Don't want you to burn yourself. Luke turned when he heard Eleanor's footstep. We're making breakfast. Papa said we should let you sleep, but I wanted to wake you up, and he said no, and... Breathe, son, Caleb said with a smile. Eleanor laughed, the sound coming easily. It smells wonderful. They ate together, the three of them, and the conversation flowed naturally. Luke told elaborate stories about the barn cats. Caleb mentioned the fence that still needed mending. Eleanor talked about planting a vegetable garden in the spring. It was ordinary. It was perfect. After breakfast, Caleb headed out to work the ranch. Eleanor was washing dishes when she heard a wagon approaching. She dried her hands and went to the window. Margaret Fletcher was climbing down from her wagon, a large basket over her arm and a knowing smile on her face. Eleanor met her at the door. Margaret, what brings you out here? Can't a friend visit? Margaret's eyes twinkled. Though I'll admit I heard something interesting in town this morning. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. Oh? Seems the whole town is talking about how Caleb Rowan and Eleanor Brooks were seen holding hands on the porch last night. Margaret grinned. Mrs. Kelly saw you from the road. You know how she is. Eleanor groaned. Already? Small town, dear. News travels faster than wildfire. Margaret came inside, setting her basket on the table. But I didn't come here to gossip. Well, not just to gossip. I came to bring you this. She pulled back the cloth covering the basket. Inside were folded lengths of fabric, cream-colored muslin, delicate lace, and soft blue cotton. Eleanor stared. Margaret, what? For a wedding dress, Margaret said matter-of-factly. I figured you'd need one eventually, and I've seen the way that man looks at you. Eventually is probably sooner rather than later. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I can't accept this. Of course you can. Besides, it's not charity. It's an investment. Margaret's expression softened. You gave this town something it desperately needed, Eleanor. You showed us that it's possible to stand up to men like Langford. You showed us what courage looks like. This is just our way of saying thank you. Eleanor embraced her, holding tight. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Margaret patted her back. Now, let's have some tea, and you can tell me all about last night. I want details. They spent the morning talking and laughing, the way women do when they're building something more permanent than simple acquaintance. By the time Margaret left, Eleanor felt like she'd found not just a home, but a community. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Caleb formally asked Eleanor to marry him in front of Luke one evening, getting down on one knee in the kitchen while the boy watched with wide, delighted eyes. Eleanor said yes before he'd even finished the question, and Luke whooped with joy, jumping up and down until the dishes rattled. They set the wedding for the first Saturday in September, when the worst of the summer heat would be past, but winter still a comfortable distance away. The whole town seemed to buzz with anticipation. Women Eleanor had never spoken to stopped her on the street with congratulations. Men tipped their hats to Caleb with knowing grins. Catherine and Sarah both returned to Marston Flats for the wedding. Catherine had found work in Cheyenne as a seamstress, her skills finally earning her honest wages and respect. Sarah had taken over management of the boarding house where she'd been staying, turning it into a proper home for women traveling alone or starting over. "We're building something," Sarah said one evening as the three women sat on Eleanor's porch, sewing the final details on the wedding dress. "Not just us individually, but together. We're proving that women like us don't need to be rescued. We can rescue ourselves." "And each other," Catherine added, threading her needle with practiced ease. Eleanor looked at these women, strangers just months ago, now friends bound by shared struggle and shared victory, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. They'd all been knocked down by the same man, but they'd all gotten back up. And in doing so, they'd changed everything. The day before the wedding, Eleanor stood in her small room at the ranch, looking at the dress hanging on the door. Margaret had outdone herself. The muslin fell in soft, elegant lines, the lace at the collar and cuffs delicate as frost. The blue cotton had been fashioned into a sash that would tie at her waist. A knock came at the door, and Caleb's voice followed. "Eleanor, can I come in?" "Yes." He entered, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, but I wanted to give you something." He held out a small wooden box, polished smooth and dark with age. Eleanor took it, her fingers tracing the intricate carving on the lid. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a ring. Not a wedding band, but a simple gold ring with a small, deep blue stone. "It was my mother's," Caleb said quietly. "My father gave it to her when they married. It's been in my family for 3 generations. I gave it to Anna when we married, and when she died, I put it away. Thought I'd never have reason to take it out again." He met Eleanor's eyes. "But I want you to have it. Not because you're taking Anna's place, no one could do that, but because you've made your own place, in this family and in my heart. And I want you to have something that says you belong here." Eleanor's vision blurred. She lifted the ring from the box, holding it up to the light. The blue stone caught the sun and glowed. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you." She looked at him, this quiet, steady man who'd given her a chance when she had nothing, who'd stood beside her when she fought back, who'd opened his home and his heart. "I love you," she said. The words came easily, naturally, because they were true. Caleb's face transformed, all the hard edges softening. "I love you too, Eleanor. I think I have since the day you fired that shotgun at Langford and didn't even flinch." They both laughed, and the sound filled the small room with warmth. The wedding took place at noon in the community hall, the same place where Eleanor had first confronted Langford. But any shadow of that night was banished by the flowers Margaret and the other women had hung from every rafter, by the sunlight streaming through the windows, by the faces of friends and neighbors filling every bench. Luke stood beside his father, wearing a new shirt Eleanor had made for him, his hair slicked down and his face scrubbed clean. He clutched the ring, Caleb's wedding band, plain and simple, in his small fist, taking his role as ring-bearer with solemn importance. Eleanor walked down the aisle alone, as she'd arrived in Wyoming. Alone, but not lonely. Not anymore. She wore her wedding dress and her mother's pearl earrings and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Luke had picked that morning. Caleb stood at the front of the hall, and when he saw her, his entire face lit up. The ceremony was simple. The minister spoke about love and commitment, about building a life together through hardship and joy. When it came time for the vows, Caleb's voice was steady and clear. "I promise to stand beside you, to work with you, to build a home with you. I promise to honor you, to protect you when you need it, and step back when you don't. I promise to love you today and every day after." Eleanor's voice shook only slightly as she spoke her own vows. "I promise to be your partner, your friend, your wife. I promise to care for Luke as my own, to make this ranch a true home. I promise to face whatever comes with courage and honesty. I promise to love you for all the days of my life." When Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger, Eleanor felt something click into place, like a door closing on the past and another opening on the future. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said. Caleb cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her softly, tenderly, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. Luke launched himself at them, wrapping his arms around both their legs, and Caleb scooped him up so the three of them stood together, a family at last. The celebration lasted well into the evening. There was food and music and dancing. Eleanor danced with Caleb, with Luke, with Margaret and Catherine and Sarah. She danced with men she'd never spoken to before, neighbors who welcomed her not as an outsider but as one of their own. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Eleanor stepped outside for a moment of quiet. She stood on the porch of the community hall, looking out at the town that had become her home. Sarah joined her, leaning against the railing. "Penny for your thoughts?" Eleanor smiled. "I was just thinking about that first day, standing on the train platform with nothing but a suitcase and a broken promise. And now? Now I have everything I never knew I needed." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You know, I used to think that what happened with Langford was the worst thing that could have happened to us, being stranded here, broke and scared, but maybe it was the best thing." Eleanor looked at her in surprise. "If he'd kept his promise, you'd be married to a con man," Sarah continued, "living a lie, never knowing the truth until it was too late. Instead, you found something real. We all did." She gestured back toward the hall where Catherine was laughing with Margaret, where Caleb was showing Luke how to play a simple tune on the fiddle. "We found ourselves. We found each other. We found out what we're made of." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes again, but they were good tears. "You're right. I wouldn't change any of it. Not the fear, not the fight, not the uncertainty. Because it led me here." "To home," Sarah said softly. "To home," Eleanor agreed. When the celebration finally wound down and the guests began to depart, Caleb helped Eleanor into the wagon. Luke was already asleep in the back, curled up on a blanket, his face peaceful. They rode home under a sky full of stars, the same stars that had witnessed Eleanor's arrival months ago. But everything was different now. When they reached the ranch, Caleb carried Luke inside and tucked him into bed. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the boys' room, watching as Caleb brushed the hair from Luke's forehead and whispered something too quiet for her to hear. Then he took her hand and led her to their room. Their room. The words still felt new and wonderful. "Are you happy?" Caleb asked, pulling her close. Eleanor thought about the question. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train with a suitcase and shattered dreams. She thought about the work, the fear, the confrontations, the courage she'd had to find deep inside herself. She thought about this man and this boy who'd become her family, not through blood or obligation, but through choice. "I'm more than happy," she said. "I'm whole." And she was. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Brooks Rowan was exactly where she belonged. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable pattern. Eleanor threw herself into making the ranch not just functional, but beautiful. She planted flowers around the porch, herbs in boxes near the kitchen window. She sewed curtains for every room and convinced Caleb to paint the shutters a cheerful blue. Luke thrived under her care. He grew taller, stronger, his laughter more frequent. He'd taken to calling her Mama without hesitation now, and every time he did, Eleanor's heart swelled. One evening in late September, as they sat down to dinner, Luke suddenly asked, "Mama, will you teach me to read?" Eleanor's hand froze halfway to her mouth. She set down her fork carefully. "You want to learn?" "Papa tried to teach me, but he's not very good at it." Luke looked at his father apologetically. "No offense, Papa." Caleb chuckled. "None taken, son. Your mama's a better teacher than I'll ever be." "Then yes," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll teach you. We'll start tomorrow." And she did. Every morning after breakfast, before the heat of the day set in, Eleanor sat with Luke at the kitchen table, teaching him letters and sounds, watching his face light up as words began to make sense. His progress was swift, his hunger for learning insatiable. "He's smart," Eleanor told Caleb one night as they lay in bed, the window open to let in the cool autumn air. "Really smart. He could go to school, maybe even university someday." Caleb was quiet for a moment. I never thought about that. Never thought we'd have the means. We'll find a way, Eleanor said firmly. He deserves every opportunity. Caleb rolled towards her, propping himself up on one elbow. How did I get so lucky? Lucky? Eleanor laughed softly. You took in a desperate stranger and gave her a job cleaning your house. Best decision I ever made. She kissed him, soft and lingering. Second best. The first was letting me stay. As autumn deepened and the leaves turned gold, word came that Langford had been transferred to the territorial prison. Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was still carrying. He was truly gone, truly unable to hurt anyone else. Catherine wrote from Cheyenne, her letters full of news about her growing business and the women she was helping through her network of seamstresses. Sarah wrote too, reporting that her boarding house had become a refuge for women starting over, a safe place where they could rebuild without judgment. Margaret visited regularly, bringing gossip and supplies and increasingly outrageous suggestions for what Eleanor should plant in the spring garden. And through it all, Eleanor worked. She worked the ranch alongside Caleb, learning to mend fences and tend cattle. She worked in the house, making it a place of warmth and welcome. She worked with Luke, watching him grow and learn and become more confident each day. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into something clean and white and new. On the first morning after the first real snowfall, Eleanor stood on the porch wrapped in a heavy shawl, watching Luke and Caleb have a snowball fight in the yard. Luke's laughter rang out, clear as a bell, and Caleb let himself get hit more often than he probably needed to, playing up his injuries to make his son laugh harder. Eleanor pressed a hand to her stomach, where a secret was just beginning to take shape. She hadn't told Caleb yet. She wanted to be sure, but she felt the truth of it in her bones, in the slight changes in her body that only she would notice. They were going to have a baby. Luke was going to be a big brother. The thought filled her with joy and terror in equal measure, but mostly joy. That night, after Luke was asleep, Eleanor told Caleb. She'd planned something elaborate, some special way to share the news, but in the end, she just blurted it out while they were washing dishes. I'm pregnant. Caleb dropped the plate he was holding. It clattered in the sink but didn't break. He turned to her, his face a mixture of shock and wonder. We're... He couldn't seem to form a complete sentence. Eleanor nodded, suddenly nervous. I think so. I'm fairly certain. Are you... He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. When he set her down, his eyes were wet. That's the best news I've ever heard, he said, his voice breaking. The absolute best. They told Luke the next morning. The boy's eyes went wide. A baby? A real baby? A real baby, Eleanor confirmed. Will it be a boy or a girl? We won't know until the baby arrives. Luke considered this seriously. Can I teach it to read? Eleanor laughed, pulling him into a hug. When the baby's old enough, absolutely. The winter passed in a cocoon of warmth and preparation. Caleb built a cradle from smooth pine, his hands careful and precise. Eleanor sewed tiny clothes, her stitches small and even. Luke drew pictures of what he thought the baby would look like and hung them on the walls. When spring came, green and fresh and full of promise, Eleanor's belly had rounded noticeably. She moved more slowly now, but she refused to stop working entirely. She planted her garden with Caleb's help, Luke fetching seeds and tools, all 3 of them working together. Margaret visited often, bringing advice and old baby clothes and stern warnings about overdoing it. Catherine and Sarah both wrote, promising to visit as soon as the baby was born. In May, on a warm evening when the crickets were singing and the stars were bright, Eleanor went into labor. Caleb sent Luke to fetch Margaret while he stayed with Eleanor, his face pale, but his hands steady. The birth was long and difficult, but when dawn broke and Eleanor heard her daughter's first cry, every moment of pain was forgotten. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a cap of dark hair, and lungs that worked remarkably well. Caleb held her with the careful reverence of a man holding something infinitely precious. Luke stood on tiptoe to peer at his sister, his face full of wonder. She's so small, he whispered. She'll grow, Eleanor said, exhausted but radiant. What will we name her? Caleb asked. Eleanor had thought about this. She'd considered family names, traditional names, meaningful names, but in the end, there was only one that felt right. Hope, she said. Her name is Hope. Caleb looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. For what we found here. For what we built, Eleanor corrected. For what we chose. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then the baby's. Hope Rowan. It's perfect. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. Hope was a good baby, content and calm, her presence filling the house with a new kind of joy. Luke took his role as big brother seriously, always gentle, always protective. On Hope's first birthday, they threw a party. Half the town came, Margaret, of course, and Catherine and Sarah, who'd traveled for the occasion, and neighbors who'd become friends, and even the minister who'd married Eleanor and Caleb. Eleanor stood on the porch that evening, Hope in her arms, watching the celebration. The ranch had been transformed. The house was painted and repaired, the barn stood straight, the fences were mended. Gardens bloomed, chickens clucked contentedly. Cattle grazed in healthy pastures. But more than that, the ranch was alive. It was full of laughter and love and the kind of messy, beautiful chaos that comes from a full life. Caleb came to stand beside her, Luke holding his hand. What are you thinking about? Eleanor looked at her husband, at her son, at her daughter. She looked at the land stretching out before them, golden in the evening light. She thought about the woman who'd arrived at the train station with nothing but a suitcase and broken dreams. I'm thinking about the summer sun, she said softly. Caleb looked puzzled. The summer sun? Eleanor smiled, remembering. The day I arrived, the sun was so bright and hot. I thought it was harsh, unforgiving, but I was wrong. It wasn't cruel, it was honest. It showed me exactly what was there, without softening it or hiding it. And because of that, I could see the truth. What truth? That I didn't need someone to save me. I needed someone to stand beside me while I saved myself. She looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And that's what you did. What we did for each other. Caleb pulled her close, careful of the baby between them. Luke pressed against their legs. They stood there together, a family forged not by circumstance or necessity, but by choice and courage and love. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. And as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Eleanor thought about all the women like her. Women who'd been lied to, abandoned, hurt. Women who'd found the strength to stand up, to fight back, to build new lives from the rubble of broken promises. She thought about Catherine in Cheyenne, creating beauty with her hands and employing other women who needed a second chance. About Sarah running her boarding house as a sanctuary. About the countless others whose names she'd never know, but whose stories echoed her own. They were all survivors. They were all fighters. They were all proof that the end of one story could be the beginning of another. And this beginning, Eleanor knew, was only just starting. Mama? Luke tugged at her skirt. Can we have cake now? Eleanor laughed, the sound full and rich and happy. Yes, sweetheart. Let's have cake. They went inside together, the four of them, into the house that had once been just a structure but was now a home. Into the life they'd built from nothing. Into the future they'd chosen. And outside, under the summer stars, the Wyoming wind whispered through the sage, carrying with it the promise of all the good things yet to come.